everyone, I'm Atuksha from Simple Crowdfunding, and for today's interview I'm here with the lovely Tina Walsh from Get Property Compliant, who's going to talk to you about compliance and sourcing. Tina, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, no problem at all. It was great fun.
Just so that everyone knows, so all the listeners understand, I've known Tina for actually a very long time. So we met back in 2013, if I recall, working or being part of a mentorship group. And we've kept in contact ever since. And actually, a lot resonates with us because we are both very interested in compliance in different areas of property, but compliance all the same. And Tina's going to share her thoughts and her knowledge with regards to property compliance and why it is so important. Before we do that though, Tina, I would love for you to explain a little bit about who you are and your background.
Well, keep it short, otherwise we'll be here for the whole interview.
True.
When I left school, I joined the police, straight out of school, and worked as a serving police officer for over 14 years. But sadly, I was injured on duty and had to leave. Back then, you couldn't do a desk job. If you couldn't work on the front line, you were pensioned out. And it hadn't been in the plan, so I didn't really know what to do because I hadn't expected that to happen. So I sort of wallowed around for a little while. And then Tony, my husband, kicked my backside out of the car one day and said, "You've got to go to the job centre. You've got to find something to do to occupy yourself."
Yeah.
And I ended up, believe it or not, working in a tile shop part-time and absolutely loving it because I loved learning about how they made the tiles and all the different tiles and how they heated at different temperatures for different finishes. So I got really into it. Mm-hmm. But then I went to night school, as we used to call it. I don't think they call it that anymore, do they? I went back to night school. Evening classes, yeah. And learned all about computing because, of course, in the police I could use the police computers, but that wasn't what was in the outside world. So I knew that to get ahead and be able to get a job in the outside world, I had to have some computer skills. So I went back to night school to learn that. And ended up doing database development and build as well, project development, monitoring and management. And I went through various amounts of jobs, from working with schools to working with speech and language therapists. And I did the usual things such as what I call candles and wicks, which is the investing online in stocks and shares. Mm-hmm. I had a little bit of a go on that, and of course, and selling books on eBay, and a myriad of all different types of things to try and make money, working from home as a full-time mum. And I know that you understand how time-consuming being at home and a full-time mum can be. In the end, I was sucked into the healthcare sector by my sister-in-law, who promised me I didn't have to wipe any bottoms or care for anyone in bed as long as I got their systems in order and in place in the office. And I started doing that. And I eventually ended up being an employee of theirs. The only person I would ever be employed by was my sister-in-law. I'm unemployable now, completely and utterly. I will never go back to being employed again. But she employed me for a period of time, and I really enjoyed frontline healthcare. It was really enjoyable, and I guess, although it wasn't policing, I got a lot out of it, if you know what I mean, because I was doing something of benefit to someone. So I got a similar feeling to being in the police, again, being in the healthcare sector. The company sold, though, very sadly, and I didn't like working for a big corporate. I said I'm unemployable, and they soon found that out. The bosses and I didn't really get on. I speak my mind a little bit, and not everybody likes that. And so I looked to see what else I could do, and I'd always wanted to set up a business, but I wasn't sure what in. Tony and I had invested in property in 2005, 2006, just before the crash, and it hurt us financially when the crash happened. So we were put off investing in property, but we'd always said for when Tony retired from the police, we wanted to have a business started. Mm-hmm. And so I went on a sort of an entrepreneurial weekend listening to a speaker who invested in property and various other businesses. I was on my own. And it then took me 6 months to get Tony to actually go, because of course he's suspicious of everyone, being a police officer, about how they're going to rob you blind. And so it took me 6 months to convince him to actually go and listen to this guy. And when he did actually, he believed that we could actually do something. And so we signed up to the same mentorship program that you and Davin signed up to, sort of 12 months later behind us. Our mentor said to us, okay, you may have been stung by investing in property, but how about property sourcing? And I said, what's that? And he said, go off and research it. And that was January 2012, and that was where it all started. And so from there, we set up our company called Potential Property Sourcing. And we've been sourcing property for investors ever since, which is approaching 9 years now, I guess. And then on the back of that, I really very quickly realised that there was a lot of regulation and legislation around what we did, but no one talked about it. And it was always in my head to write a book and move into that area of it. And of course, in 2017, I wrote and launched the book. And then history is as history is, as they say, and I'm where I am now. And I do about 35 presentations around the UK, usually apart from COVID and the sad situation we're in at the moment, in a year, and educate sources to operate legally, compliantly and ethically, and educate investors to what to look for a compliant sourcer to help protect them from losing their hard-earned cash. And that's where we're up to at the moment.
And it's been incredibly colourful, hasn't it? Which is wonderful to hear. Oh, yes. With regards to property sourcing, for those who may not know, what is property sourcing?
For me, property sourcing is like any other property business. It's a people business. And people laugh at me when I say that, because they look at bricks and mortar and houses and flats and development sites and whatever else is incorporated in property investment, if you like, as a sector. But for me, I'm a very people person, despite the fact I was a police officer. I've been a people person. I like speaking to people. And as a sourcer, you have to bring two people together. You have to bring a seller together with a buyer. So you have to be a people person, want to understand both perspectives and bring them together in a way whereby what I say is a win-win-win situation. So the seller wins, the sourcer wins, and the buyer wins. And then you have a good deal and it's more likely to go over the line. So for me, it's a people business. It's one where you have to really love what you want to do, because we don't get paid up front for it. This isn't a salaried job. There's an awful lot of work, as you know from what you guys do, up front before you actually get any payment at all. But yeah, for me, definitely it's a people business. And I think a lot of sources look at getting the money in the bank rather than looking at the issues that people are facing, especially sellers, who they're dealing with, to try to get that BMV, and I really don't like the term, but that great deal that everybody's looking for, that in order to get what they're looking for, there has to be a lot of distress on the part of the seller quite often. And they don't look at that, and for me, see them as being people. They look at it as the deal. They see the bricks and mortar, and they tune in on the bricks and mortar and the deal, and they kind of forget that there's a human being at the back of it, that is going through a really, really tough time. And I prefer to switch it around and consider them to be people and human beings. And whenever we work directly with the seller, one of the first conversations that we have is that if working with Tony and I in our company will put them in a worse financial position than they're already in, we won't work with them and signpost them. I just won't do it. I won't do it, because I don't think that's what true professional business should be about. I mean, obviously, sometimes you can help them if you have the skill set, so you know someone that has, but it's definitely a people person. I think that's what a lot of sources forget, because they're sold the roses around the door of being able to make money quickly. Yeah. And so they focus on the money and the money in the bank.
Absolutely. So just going back a step, so for property sourcing, you have sellers, so people who want to sell their property. You have the sourcer, who's the person in the middle who finds that opportunity, and then you have an investor who wants to buy it. Is that correct?
Yes, I call us go-betweens. Yeah. We work virtually exactly the same way as an estate agent, but we are if you like, contracted to the buyer because they're normally the ones that pay our fee. So rather than a high street estate agent whose contracted client is a seller, our contracted client tends to be the buyer, but we bring the two parties together just as an estate agent would do, just from the opposite ends of the scale, if you like.
Yeah, so there's there's a few things actually that need to be considered as part of any setup when it comes to sourcing. Just going back for people who may not know, BMV is below market value. So where you try and buy a property at below its current market value. And there are people who are open to selling at that level because they just want to get out quickly. But what Tina's saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, is if it affects them as people, it's best that you don't go there and find another property. That's correct, isn't it?
Yeah, I think you have to, depends on your skill set. So for argument's sake, for repossessions and that sort of thing, my skill set isn't down that road and I'm not experienced at doing it. So I wouldn't want someone to lose a property because I said I could deal with a situation and I can't. So if they need special financial help because they're on the verge of losing a property, then I would signpost them to someone that could help at the moment. Tony's actually doing a course at the moment on repossession so that we can actually take on board more of that level. But I won't take on anything that I don't feel that I could actually help and support them in the way that they need help and support. I won't abandon them. We will signpost them, then it's up to them as to whether they take that advice or not. But there are levels that we draw the line at. But yes, we may be able to get a quick sale for them, but would that leave them, you know, in huge debt when there are other avenues that they could look at? And I think it's from a sourcing perspective, you're seeing the seller, their distressed situation, and saying, well, okay, but maybe working with us isn't the best for the person, the human being behind the deal, rather than I can get a great deal out of this. They're really stressed and I think I can get it dirt cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and that is one part of the puzzle, isn't it, as such? There's still the investors you need to consider as well. So do investors come to you and say, I'm looking for X type of property in this particular area? How does it work?
We work probably differently to most of the sources in so much as we don't find a deal and then try to find a buyer for it, which is the general way that sourcing is taught these days, deal packaging, whatever you want to call it. We work with registered investors. So our investors approach us in various ways and they'll say, can you help me, Tina? I'm looking to build up a buy-to-let portfolio in this area. I'm looking at spending X amount of pounds per property and my investment goal is a yield of or a cash flow of or whatever it is that they're looking for. And we, generally speaking, build relationships up with our investors for lots of reasons, but because that's how we work. But also I think that the deeper that you dig and the more knowledge you have as to what they're looking for exactly. And the term that I always tell people that I'm working with that want to learn how to source is to ask an investor, if you send a deal across to them, how will they assess that deal? In what way will they assess it to work out if it works for them or not? Because if you're both singing off the same hymn sheet, you're more likely to be able to tick all of the boxes or at least know what those boxes look like.
It probably takes less time as well overall, doesn't it? Because you're not constantly going backwards and forwards and seeing what sticks, really, are you? It's a very tailored approach by the sound of it.
Yeah, we call it sourcing to order. It's bespoke approach, very much for their what they're looking for. And if we don't feel that we can fulfill their criteria, then we don't work with them because it will be a waste of their time and a waste of ours. You always get some investors coming off courses that have unrealistic expectations, shall we say, as to what can be achieved in certain areas or what they may be able to invest in. And whilst we never, ever, ever give investment advice, I can say to them, I know from experience that isn't going to work in that area because you haven't got enough money or what you're looking for just doesn't exist. Or if you want to joke about it, when you find one, let me know and I'll buy it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true, isn't it? With regards to these relationships then, talking to investors, we're obviously talking about substantial sums of money being exchanged at some point, right? So because of that, there's quite a lot of paperwork that also needs to be done in the middle. So I want to talk to you about the property sourcing compliance aspects in particular, because I know a lot of people don't fully appreciate it, understand it, know it, or actually, in fact, they don't even know it exists. So can you tell us what property sourcing compliance actually means?
Whenever you run a business, there is always legislation and regulation that will govern you in part or in full, whatever that business is that operates. If you're an employee, if you're in for business premises, if you're driving your car for business, there's always snippets that will affect how you operate. And as property sources, we're no different. We're actually considered to be what's known as an estate agency type business. And so property sourcing compliance for us gears around what legislation and regulation govern the estate agency sector, property sales sector, of which there's about 14 pieces of legislation and regulation at this moment in time. And quite often constantly changing, as you know. Interpretations change, legislation is written and then it's reinterpreted. So it's about the rules and regulations that govern how we as property sourcers should set up, what professional registrations, insurances, documentation we should have in place. It also includes processes and procedures and risk assessments that we should have in place, but also generally about our professionalism on a day-to-day basis, about us operating professionally and being open and honest about a deal, about a seller, about circumstances, and not hiding anything or being misleading and so on and so forth. And the compliance, you can come at it from two angles, I guess. One is from the sources side, which is sort of from my side, what we have to have in place to operate as a sourcer. But also the other side, from the investor's perspective, because if as an investor you want to work with a sourcing agent and you have no idea what they have to go through to be compliant, or what questions to ask to try to protect yourself, then you're on a back foot before you even start. So I know I've worked with investors who have worked with sourcers and lost a lot of money, despite the fact that that sourcer came highly recommended from various Facebook groups. So recommendation isn't always necessarily a guarantee of success. Nothing is. But if you understand the steps required that a sourcer has to go through, you understand what questions to ask. If you don't get the right answers, then you have a better grounding as to whether you think you want to work with that sourcer or not, based on how much protection you think you're going to get. So for argument's sake, if they aren't registered with an ombudsman, which legally they must be, if a problem occurs with the deal that you're going through with the sourcer and you want to make a complaint, you've got nowhere to go because they aren't registered with the ombudsman. So that knowledge can be key, not just to ensuring that a sourcer is set up professionally, but also giving you some knowledge that the sources don't expect you to have, and you can ask questions of them and then just see what the responses are. Because I gauge, and I still stand by the fact that I believe at least 95% of sources that operate in the UK are not fully compliant. And a lot of investors lose an awful lot of money on deals, you and I both know that, on a weekly basis. And we're not talking necessarily small sums of money either. You could be talking hundreds of thousands of pounds if something goes seriously wrong.
Yeah.
And so the compliance has an effect on both sides. We as sources setting up and running professionally, but investors understanding not all of what we have to do, but snippets of what we have to do so that they can ask the right questions to help protect themselves and ensure that who they're working with at least understands the compliance and has those things in place which not only set them up professionally as sourcing agents, but also help to protect the investor should anything go wrong. And we hope it doesn't, but you and I both know, having done deals ourselves, that things can go wrong, things unforeseen can crop up. And you know, the longer that you work in any sector, the more likely something is going to happen whereby you have a complaint made against you. It doesn't mean that you're a nasty person or you've done anything necessarily wrong, but things go wrong. But if you have all of those professional pointers in place and you have a professional stance with the investor, then you're much more likely to be able to deal with that complaint, that issue, without it being escalated, than if you shut up shop, disappear, stop responding to your emails because you've no idea how to deal with it. And then the investor risks losing tens of thousands of pounds.
What surprised, 95% is a staggering number. And I'm trying to understand why that is. Is it because people are just not aware of it? There's obviously a lot of property sourcing and deal packaging courses and all things like that. Is compliance not a focus of that? What do you think it is?
It's not a sexy subject, Atuksha, let's face it, is it?
That's very true. I get that.
I love it. You love it. From the remit that you come from, I really enjoy it, and I find it easy to understand, and I get that a lot of people don't. I think there are three categories that we deal with for people in the sourcing sector. There are those that absolutely have no knowledge of it, but haven't researched what it means to set up a business. It's a big thing, setting up a business. Even a limited company, there are regulations around how you can run it and how you deal with it. But people never look into the ramifications of doing, they just think it's setting up a business and they just do it. But there can be ramifications if it's done wrong or run incorrectly. And it's the same with the property sourcing sector, in so much as they think about property sourcing, they're taught that it's a quick way to get cash to then be able to go on and invest in doing deals themselves, not doing deals themselves, but investing in property themselves. But they don't stop and think about, I'm setting up a business, so what regulations might be around that. They just don't stop and think about it. They see the money and they go ahead. So in part, they've been naive, possibly poorly educated, or they just haven't known that it's there and not thought. My first thought when I started looking into sourcing was what legislation governs it, but that's my background. Not everyone thinks in that way. So with those that are a little bit naive and just haven't thought about it, maybe never had a sourcing a course, or the course didn't talk about it. There are those that attend courses and that are partially aware but not fully aware and don't look further into it. And then there are those that have a very good idea about it but don't give a damn and just don't do it anyway. So I think they fall into three categories.
I completely agree with you on that. And even from an investment standpoint, I would say exactly that. So there are always people who just don't know. You only know what you know. And so, but once they're told, or once they learn about it, then actually they're on the right path. There are people who will consider it, but it has to be convenient, I would suggest. And there are some people who know about it, but actually I've been doing it this way and it's been fine, and I'm not interested because it's just too much hassle, if that's what it is. But actually, what I was going to say is, for those people, it's a business choice at that point, isn't it? So, but one of the things that
they decide to go that way, you can't force them to do something. You can lead a horse to water, you can't make it drink, can you? Absolutely. I think the other major issue is that in the main, sources come into the sector because they don't have the cash to invest. And there is a cost to the compliance, even on the initial setup. There is a cost to it. And a lot of them are paid thousands of pounds for steel packaging courses. And some of the courses now, since I've been standing on my pedestals and shouting about compliance, have incorporated bits and pieces of compliance into what they talk about. But in the main, that's about the registrations and insurance. What they don't talk about is what sits under that. And I always say to everyone, the registrations and the insurance are the tip of the iceberg of what compliance for sources is. It's what sits underneath that's going to hurt you financially if you screw it up. So registering is sticking your head above the parapet and people know that you're there. But if you don't have the documentation, the processes in place that legally you're supposed to have, and you're checked, You know, an average fine at the moment from HMRC is running at £5,000. Now, considering sources come into the sector because they don't have that level of cash, and they're told to do a few deals to get the money in to pay for the compliance, you know, there's a vicious circle there, and a lot of people are leaving themselves really wide open for heavy fines before they even get their sourcing business off the ground.
Absolutely, and it's about it's a really interesting concept, because when you're a small business, that's the time to actually embrace this change, isn't it? And to do things properly, because you're doing it on a smaller scale. Because as your business grows and it grows and it grows, if it's built on unstable foundations, that's when it becomes much more complicated to try and fix it. And I find that quite surprising. One of the things that you mentioned, which is, it goes across the board, and I see it a lot in the property sector, regardless of whether it's sourcing or construction or whatever else, is what you were saying about businesses and responsibilities. So the fact that you run a business, we constantly come across people who don't really understand what GDPR means and what they should be doing about it. Oh, I've got a disclaimer on my site so people can opt out. Actually, that's not good enough. And things like that. So there are business aspects to the compliance you talk about, and then also the regulatory aspects as well, aren't there? So could you give me some other examples of maybe each of those areas when it comes to property sourcing?
I think what a lot of people forget is that as property sources, they'll put up one-page websites, won't they, attracting investors or sellers who want to sell their property quickly. And what they forget is that legally they're supposed to have a privacy usage policy on the site. They're supposed to have all of the contact details of their company easily and clearly available on the site, and also a cookie policy on the site. And in order to have that, you have to have an understanding as to how your website works. Which they don't think about. And as you say, it's got to be an opt-in now for receiving further information, not an opt-out as it used to be, which a lot of people don't get. And the other thing about GDPR, which is interesting as well, is that on the opt-in section, if you get someone to tick a box and say to you, I'm ticking this box because I'm accepting this free report on the 8 top tips for people to sell houses quickly in the UK, and then you start sending them all information about your sourcing services and do they want to sell the house, do they know anybody that does, that's actually in breach of the regulations, because they've ticked to say that they're getting a free report, and that's all they've given you permission to send. And you know, there are depths to the regulations that people don't understand, that they really need to have an understanding of. And as you say, it's just the sheer professionalism and the fact that you're operating a business. And surely you want that business to have longevity.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so I think they know that GDPR exists. I think these blinkers come down and say, oh, I know what it does, but I'm not holding anyone's data. It's not in danger. I only have 3 clients. I don't have that much information. Blah, blah, blah. I can forget about it. It doesn't mean anything to me. And they kind of stick their heads in the sand and pretend that all of this lot will go away. And it isn't a problem for them. The one comment that I hear an awful lot is that the governance for GDPR and money laundering, they're not interested in the little guys. They've got bigger fish to go after. Well, I'm sorry, but I've got news for you. And that just isn't the case.
It's so true. And
that's like saying I'm drug smuggling and only doing time. I always say to people, would you get into someone's car if you knew that they didn't have insurance to drive the car? And they always come back and say, no, why would I do that? Well, why would you run your business in an unprofessional way without insurance or understanding what you should have in place for the protection of people who get in your business car and ride with you? You wouldn't do it. Why expect someone else to do it? It's just, people come into business from having maybe a 9-to-5 job and working for someone else and don't realise how difficult running a business is, how time consuming it is, and how much red tape there is around the running of a business. And I think that's part of the problem.
Yeah,
Because
and that's just on the,
tell
sorry.
the roses around your story, don't they?
Yeah.
You know, this is set up. You can have money in the bank in a month. You can work this from your kitchen table, holding down a full-time job with 6 children in the background. You know, they don't point out the difficulties and the legislation and regulation. Because, I mean, this is only my opinion, but for me, the reason that they don't do is because no one, or very few, would sign up for this £3,000, £4,000, £5,000 deal packaging course if they knew a lot of what was in the back end. Yeah. Because the amount of people that have come to me and said, I wish I'd have known about the compliance first, Tina, I wouldn't have done the course because it's not for me.
Yeah.
And that to me is really, really sad that people have wasted that level of money, when if they'd have been told the whole picture, they could have made an educated and adult decision based on all of the information rather than just the glorified bit.
Yeah, it's also for having the insight and knowledge to then ask the right questions if they do want to progress it. And it means then they get a lot more information that's usable for their business rather than the high level stuff alone. One of the things you mentioned was about AML. So that obviously falls into compliance, not business compliance, but a regulatory aspect. So there's a number of areas like that as well, which people just don't really understand. Because I hear it all the time. Well, you know, we'll ask someone to self-cert at a basic level. So as long as they self-cert as a high net worth or sophisticated, I'm done. But actually, it doesn't work that way, does it?
No, the self-certification side from your perspective is because you're pooling funds, aren't you, in your crowdfunding platform, which is FCA governed, which I know that you guys had to jump through many hoops to get. As sourcing agents, the FCA aren't particularly interested in the sale of property at this moment in time. So there are a few aspects that we have to be aware of, and one of them is not giving investment advice, which obviously you have to be FCA regulated, so that would fall under the remit of the FCA regulations. The pooled investment type things, you know, JVs and that kind of thing. But anti-money laundering generally from our perspective is, what is expected of us is not to be Sherlock Holmes, but to do the checks that we can do based on our risk assessment of a client and which category they fall in. And you're expected to have low or high risk. Those are the 2 categories that we have to work with. And you have to decide who falls into your low risk and who falls into your high risk, and what procedures you attach to each of those descriptions, like as to what process you go through when you've identified them as one or the other. And that's mainly for the buyers, but under the regulations, we are obligated to carry out the due diligence on the seller as well, even if we're going through an estate agent or another agent with them. And the key thing for the seller is, did they really have a legal right to sell a property? Have they laundered money through the original purchase of the property? Because what people don't realise is, as investors, you could be buying a property off someone that's used it to launder money.
It's
and
so
this
true.
can be a problem for you.
Of course.
It can be a problem for you. And as sourcing agents, we really don't want that connection. Our investor wouldn't want to work with us anymore if we've dumped on them a deal which was actually had money laundered through it in the first place. So you need to understand the kind of triggers that may say, okay, this may not be laundering money, but it's triggered that query in my head. I need to ask more questions. And from the investor's side, from a sourcing perspective, the key thing on the money laundering is not that they have the cash to buy. From paying our bills, yes, that is key. But from a money laundering perspective and regulatory perspective, it's where did that cash come from?
Yes.
And the one thing that no one wants to ask anybody is, where did you get that money from? Because we're English, aren't we? And we don't like talking about that kind of thing. But there are 2 perspectives to these questions as well that are a difficulty in the sector at the moment. We, as a sector, we work with investors who aren't used to being asked these questions. And they don't like being asked these questions. And they feel that only their solicitor should be asking them these questions. But unfortunately, under the money laundering regulations, the estate agency type sector is right on the front line. And even if you buy a property through a high street estate agent, at the point when an offer is accepted, they are supposed to then stop the purchase process and do due diligence on the buyer, even though the buyer isn't their contracted client. Just as we are supposed to do due diligence on the seller, despite the fact that they aren't our contracted client.
Yeah. And
so, you know, there are a lot of checks that have to be done, and it's amazing the amount of sources that have no idea about anti-money laundering checks. If the one way to filter out the sources who know what they're talking about or not is to ask to see their AML risk assessment and watch the goldfish bowl expression of the goldfish at the end. Because, you know, it's... but I hear a lot of investors who say, I don't care if they're compliant or not, as long as the deal stacks up. Well, you don't care until you need to care when everything's gone wrong and you've lost a lot of money. And then you've got nowhere to go and there's no insurance to fall back on.
Yeah, and
you know,
this is the challenge, isn't it? So I know that you have tips for both sources and also investors in terms of what investors should be asking, what sources should be looking out for when they're getting started, and those tips basically would just guide people through, or it will guide them in terms of what they should be looking for. Is that correct?
Yeah, the sourcing report, if you like, or downloadable document is called the 12 Steps to Compliance. And basically, I've broken the steps to compliance down into 12 steps. It basically talks them through the 12 steps. From the investor's side, there are 7 questions that investors should ask a source before working with them. And part of that is what documents they have to have in place and contracts and everything. But it also gives them the answers that they should be getting. And if not, then they have to make what will then be a more educated decision as to whether they decide personally to carry on in conversation with that source, so dependent on the answers they've got, or whether they walk away. But at least they'll be doing that from a position where they know what these guys should have. It's up to them to decide as to whether they feel they can still work with them or not. But it just gives them that heads up as to what should be in place, and some silly little things such as an in-house complaints process. And legally we are supposed to have one, because unless you go through the in-house complaints process, the ombudsman won't deal with your complaint, even if a sourcer is registered with them. So if the sourcer doesn't have one and just keeps califaging you via email and just putting you off, you can't go through the process because they don't have one. And it's just something that simple, that if they've got this in place, then they at least have a certain amount of knowledge as to what they should have in place, and you can see it. Have they got a terms of business contract that you as an investor can sign, but before you sign it, you can read through and see what is stipulated in it? There are 2 biggest complaints that I get from investors that have lost money using sources. And the first one is that the deal that they bought didn't stack up, wasn't as promised, blah, blah, blah. And I say, well, did you sign a terms of business? Well, no, we didn't. It was just word of mouth. So there was no agreement between them as to what could be expected. There was no agreement as to what sourcing fee was to be expected and when it should have been paid. And the other one is, I bought this deal, but actually when I came to do the refurbishment, it cost me an awful lot more, or it wasn't fit for purpose.
So, and also there have been instances where investors were made to think that planning wouldn't be a problem, and then it later was a problem, and things like that, right? Yeah,
either development planning or HMO approval. And I've chatted to an investor recently who purchased a property, did a full refurb to HMO standards. The HMO officer went round and then refused to give the license because the room sizes were wrong.
Yeah, and this was after being told
that this was that they chatted to the HMO officer, that they'd been out to the, and this was all contained in emails. But then because there wasn't other compliance measures in place, such as an ombudsman registration, no insurance, it's going to cost you more to try to get the money back that way. Then you've got to do the due diligence up front. It is still buyer beware. There is no 2 ways about it. There are checks that you can do, but you've got to be buyer beware. You really have. And I think my heart goes out to people who are sort of coming into property investment and don't really have the knowledge of refurbishments or costs or anything like that. And they really need to learn how to do those calculations before they trust a sourcer. They really do, because if you have no understanding what you're looking at, how can you know if it's wrong?
Yeah, absolutely.
You can't. And people trust with tens of thousands of pounds. It staggers me, absolutely staggers me. And the other thing that investors are doing is handing over sourcing fees or thousands of pounds in cash up front to reserve deals, and then not checking as to whether that money is refundable at any stage and where it's going to be held. They just don't check. And then something goes wrong with the deal and they say, I went wrong, I want my money back. And then all of a sudden, no, it's not refundable. But they haven't signed a terms of business agreement, so they haven't even asked the question in the first place. So as investors, you've got to start helping yourselves, but you need that little bit of education to know what questions to ask. And then you can make that decision to walk away or not based on the information that you're given.
Yeah. Well, one of the things I absolutely love about what you do, that there are many, but this one as well, is about providing education to get property sorters up to a certain level of knowledge. And I know you were running a number of courses pre-COVID, which you've actually made available online now, haven't you? Can you sort of just run through what type of information is covered during those training courses or training sessions, and what sources should expect having been through it?
The initial course really that I always recommend to anyone is what was my one-day course pre-COVID, which we've now moved to 5 days online in a private Facebook group. Using Zoom conferencing, and if you can't attend when it's live, I record it and put the link into the group so you can catch up. And you have sort of 2 weeks to get through the course material now. And the course basically covers the 12 steps, but the PDF download is just the 12 steps and the basics. We go into much more detail and in depth as to not just the regulations and legislation, but how that knits with day-to-day sourcing and how that affects how you work. So it's more talking about sourcing. I don't teach how to source on the course, but we talk about sourcing and then how the compliance knits with all of those processes that we do on a day-to-day basis. And we do what I call a deep dive into GDPR and anti-money laundering. Not just about the regulations and the core documents, but how it affects how you work. And I talk them through my onboarding procedure for one of my investors. So I talk them through the entire process that we take them through, along with all of the electronic systems now that we have that help us to streamline that process. And we cover sort of what is essential, what they really should have from the beginning, and then what they could build up to an add-on over a period of time once they start creating that income that allows them to be able to do it. And questions and answers, questions are very welcome in the group, and they can ask questions. And I go in the evenings between 7 and 8 to do a typed response on the Q&A to any questions. So rather than it just being a one day and all crammed, it's over 5 days. 10 till 12 in the morning to lunchtime is the live training, which is all recorded, and then the link goes into the group. And there's lots of free resources in there, and they can ask any questions that they want, and they have 2 weeks to go through the entire course. And at the end of it, they get a great in-depth look at anti-money laundering, GDPR, the 12 steps to compliance, and what they absolutely have to have in place to run as a compliant sourcer. They have an option partway through the course to purchase an online course which has all the documentation that they need to make them compliant initially when they start working. So for the package, they can then start going away and operating as a fully compliant sourcer with the terms of business, policies, procedures, risk assessments, everything that they need in place, and get those foundations built really, really well right at the very beginning. And even if they're not sure if sourcing is for them, they can come on the initial 5 day course. And if the compliance blows their mind and they decide that sourcing absolutely isn't for them, then they haven't wasted a huge amount of money on being taught how to source. And that's what I always say to people: anyone can teach you how to source for a few £1,000s, but do the 5 day course on compliance. And then if you're still not put off by it and think that is not for me, then you can go and pay for your deal packaging course wherever you want. But work out first if sourcing is actually for you before you fork out that money.
And actually, on that basis, if you're paying a few £1,000s for a deal sourcing course, to do the compliance course is considerably cheaper, and actually will affect any business that you set up. It's not just restricted to sourcing, is it?
No, it's considerably cheaper to do the compliance bit up front if that's what you want to do, and then save up to do the deal packaging. But I always say that deal packaging sourcing is not rocket science. There were no courses out there when I started for me to learn. I just worked it out as I went along and put the compliance in place. So yeah, the 5-day online version of the course, the next one starts on Monday the 8th of June, and it's £97 per person for the 5-day course.
Okay. Okay. And is there a comparable course for people who might want to, or who are considering investing and who don't know what to look out for?
No, what I do is I give free telephone calls.
Okay. So,
an investor is in having a chat with me. There's a document that I know that you guys are going to put up on your site for them to download. Yeah. If they have any more questions, any queries, or they've got a problem, I offer free telephone call consultations to investors where I help and support as much as I possibly can do.
Perfect. And for people, if they want to get in touch with you or find out more about your course, where would they go?
The best place, one of the best places, and it's free for resources, as well as my Facebook group, which is private. You have to apply to come in. It's free of charge to join. And that is Property Sourcing Compliance Support with Tina Walsh. If you want a more direct approach, you can email me directly at Tina, T-I-N-A, at spsuk.co.uk. I'm on Facebook. You can message me on Facebook. We're also on Twitter and Instagram and all sorts of places which Tony deals with. But you'll find me all over social media if you search for Tina Walsh and Property Sourcing Compliance. Email or the Facebook group are probably the best places to get in touch with me.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And what I would say is I've been following Tina's journey for quite some time, and the posts are just hilarious. I love them. They're very, very serious, and they make an incredible point. And being in compliance as well, and wanting to do things maybe slightly differently to what the market is used to is a challenge. And so seeing compliance comments come out, I absolutely love. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time.
You're welcome. I have a lot of fun doing it, and it's my end goal. We had a 10-year plan when we started, and we're still ongoing with it. You know, and we're getting closer and closer. We will get there. We will get there. There's a lot coming in the next 12 to 18 months.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Oh, your book title is again?
Property Sourcing Compliance, Keeping You on the Right Side of the Law, and it's available on Amazon at the moment. The baseline price is $24.97, but Amazon fluctuates and I have no control over that. It never goes higher than that, but sometimes it can be lower than that.
And it sold thousands of copies, hasn't it? So
yeah,
there is
definitely approaching 3,000 copies now, probably since we launched in October 2017. Yeah, I would think so, yeah.
So the message is getting out there, which is wonderful.
It is, and we need it to continue because we need to educate everyone, the sources and the investors, because it's only that way that we can actually clean up our act, stand alongside lettings and estate agents professionally, and not be laughed out of Facebook groups as being amateurs, because we won't be anymore, and that is the goal.
I love the story that you were saying that some course instructors actually call you by your surname now because they're not overly impressed with the compliance guidance you're providing.
I was warned many years ago that when I stick my head above the parapet, someone will try and fire it off because they won't like what I'm saying, and that's absolutely fine. I don't have a problem with that. I faced an armed robber who'd shot a colleague with a sawn-off shotgun. I can take anything that anyone can throw at me, so I'm not going anywhere in any hurry, Atuksha. Don't you worry about that.
I think that's absolutely the best approach to take, Tina, and I absolutely love what you're doing. And if it means there's a lot more property sources who are doing things correctly, it just means it creates a nicer environment for everybody in property, and it goes towards the bigger cause, which is just absolutely wonderful. So Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the invitation. I've really enjoyed it.
Take care.
Thank you. Bye.